We begin the day with the most anticipated moment in U.S. President Biden's visit to the Middle East. Today, Biden arrived in Saudi Arabia. On his way to greet the king, he was met by the Crown Prince. It was a 5-second exchange that grabbed half the world's attention. The U.S. president greeted Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman with a fist bump. No small talk, no smiles. Both appeared more than willing to get it over with as quickly as possible. Now, up until today, Biden had refused to speak with the Crown Prince. 2 years ago, as he campaigned to become U.S. president, Biden accused the Crown Prince of serious human rights abuses, and he vowed to make him a pariah. So why in the world did Biden make Saudi Arabia a stop on his first tour of the Middle East? Biden needs the Saudis' help to bring down oil prices. And so far, they've refused to pump more. Even if they change course, even if that helps bring down the price at the pump for U.S. consumers, what will be the ultimate price? Biden, for many, is now seen as a backpedaling president who just paid a visit to a prince who does not look much like a pariah.
This was U.S. diplomacy in Saudi Arabia not long ago. Former President Donald Trump performing a sword dance. Trump and his administration embraced the country and its crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman, known as MBS. That was despite the country's widespread human rights abuses and the murder of dissident journalist Jamal Kashoggi at the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. Multiple investigations said the order to kill Khashoggi must have come from the top, from bin Salman himself. Many world leaders condemned MBS. That puts President Joe Biden in a tough spot. When he was a candidate, he called for Saudi Arabia to be treated as a pariah nation. But Biden needs to address oil prices, which have spiked, largely due to Russia's war in Ukraine. Biden also needs the Saudis' help against U.S. adversary Iran, which is ramping up its nuclear program. Washington is pushing the Saudis to cooperate with Israel despite a history of mistrust and conflict against Iran. Both countries consider Tehran an arch foe. Saudi Arabia, with its huge oil reserves, has made itself impossible to ignore for decades. It's used its power over energy markets to both hurt and help the U.S. In the 1970s, the Saudis contributed to the U.S. economy tumbling into recession with oil embargoes. But in later decades, the Saudis were seen as a dependable partner in providing oil and as an ally in an unfriendly region. Then came September 11th. Most of the hijackers of the planes that flew into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon were Saudis, many with high-reaching connections. But Washington played it down. This friendly attitude continued when Mohammed bin Salman took over. He cultivated ties with President Trump's family, and Trump refused to condemn him for the Khashoggi murder. Joe Biden prefers to speak to MBS's father, King Salman, who officially rules the country, but the king has been ill and has rarely been seen in public in recent years. All that oil and the enormous sums the kingdom has to invest worldwide keeps Saudi Arabia relevant, and that means dealing directly with whoever's in charge.
Well, my first guest tonight is Ken Roth, Executive Director of Human Rights Watch. He joins me tonight from Geneva, Switzerland. Ken, it's good to see you again. I want to start with the optics of what we saw today, the bump fist that President Biden shared with the Saudi Crown Prince. What did that cost the U.S. president?
Well, look, I think that, the big question that you posed in this opening is, is Biden seen as selling his human rights principles for the possibility of a smidgen more of Saudi oil down the road? There's no immediate promise, but maybe in the future. But Biden wanted to be seen to be trying to fight inflation, so he went to Saudi Arabia. And the question is he, while he's there, signaling his ongoing profound concern about the Saudi Crown Prince's abysmal human rights record? And so far, he has utterly failed. The fist pump was supposed to be short of a handshake, but that's not enough. That's not a statement of human rights principles. He then met with the Crown Prince alone and came out and recounted what had happened. And it was a really a poor performance, to be honest with you. He said, we discussed human rights and political reform, which are, meaningless statements. The Saudi people have no idea what specific abuses Biden talked about. They had an exchange about the Jamal Kashoggi murder. Biden said, you, Mohammed bin Salman, ordered it. MBS said, no, I didn't. They said, well, we disagree, move on, basically. And then, Biden had this almost incoherent statement where he said, dealing with Saudi critics abroad is a violation of human rights. He couldn't even get himself to say killing Saudi critics abroad or threatening Saudi critics abroad or arresting their families back in the kingdom. Those are all things that happen. Those are violations of human rights. He couldn't even get that out of his mouth. So, what you get is this sort of minimalist, tokenist reference to human rights as if somehow that makes up for this huge legitimacy boost that Biden has given the Saudi crown prince by going to Jeddah and meeting with him.
And what I'm reading here is that President Biden, he was asked, what about if there is another Jamal Khashoggi, another murder? And the president is quoted as saying, if anything like that occurs again, they'll get the response that they deserve and much more. That is going to ring hollow, though, in the Saudi kingdom, isn't it, after the visit today?
Well, that's the problem. I mean, what happened after the last murder? He was declared a pariah, and here we are a little over a year later, and he's welcomed back into the fold because the United States, wants to be seen as pushing for more Saudi oil, so Biden can be seen as having been, really fighting to lower inflation in advance of the midterm elections. I mean, this is not a principled stance for human rights. Everybody can be for human rights when it's easy. The question is, what if there's a price to be paid? And Biden showed he's not willing to pay that price. The other thing he cites as well, there is a ceasefire in Yemen, and everybody's happy that there's a ceasefire in Yemen. That's a horrible conflict. But, Mohammed bin Salman has vehemently fought any accountability for the systematic bombing of Yemeni civilians. So if the ceasefire fails, we have every reason to believe that Yemeni civilians are going to be targeted again. Or Biden cites, this new rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Israel, where there now was a direct flight between the two, and they're going to cooperate in fighting Iran. But, the truth is, both Saudi Arabia and Israel have their own deep interests in opposing Iran. They don't need to have the U.S. government give up its human rights principles to achieve that.
I'm going to come back to Yemen in just a moment, but let's stick with the notion here of oil. The Biden administration wants Saudi Arabia to pump more oil. Saudi Arabia's spare capacity, as I understand it, is rather modest. I mean, the impact on fuel prices would also be modest. That's what economists are saying. So how can this be worth so much to the U.S. president? Is this all about getting prices to come down at the gas pump right before the midterm elections? Is that what this is all about?
No, I think this is all about Biden pretending to be doing something about inflation. And there's a limit to what he can do. It's mainly in the hands of the Fed and the raising of interest rates and the like. But Biden, is being held responsible by many Americans for the rise in gas prices in particular. So even though there's not a lot he can do, even though Saudi Arabia, as you say, does not have a lot of spare capacity, it's not even promising to use anything right now. It's saying maybe down the road they'll pump a bit more. It's the cosmetics, the look, Biden being able to go there, as he said tonight, and say, I pushed for more oil to fight inflation. That's what this is about. And that is not something to give up basic human rights principles for.
And Ken, how do you explain U.S. foreign policy? We've got a war going on right now in Ukraine. So you've got Vladimir Putin, head of Russia. You've got the Saudi crown prince, the de facto leader there of Saudi Arabia. Both of these men are responsible and behind attacks on innocent civilians, one being in Ukraine, the other being in Yemen. They're not accountable, really, to anyone. They're not democratically elected, at least the crown prince is not. And yet the United States chooses to stand with Saudi Arabia and now has turned Vladimir Putin into a pariah. How do you explain that?
Well, look at it. First of all, we should be clear that Putin's not fairly elected either. They both are autocrats, unaccountable to their people, each of them able to pursue a war, Putin in Ukraine, MBS in Yemen, with horrible consequences. My fear is that President Biden is missing the forest for the trees here. he's too focused on, maintaining a military coalition against Russia. To do that, he needs to keep inflation down. Therefore, he needs Saudi Arabia to pump more oil. But what he's missing in that is that, the Ukraine conflict is perhaps more importantly central in the global contest between democracy and autocracy. And China is the main adversary there. And the Chinese government and other autocrats love to say, well, we may be autocrats, but democratic leaders are hypocritical. They don't even stick up for democratic principles when the going gets tough. And I'm afraid that this Biden trip to Saudi Arabia, this re-embrace of the Saudi crown prince, is going to be exhibit A in the case of the autocrats claiming that democratic principles are really just principles of hypocrisy. So that risks, maybe gaining a little bit and building the anti-Russia coalition around Ukraine, but losing a whole lot in this global contest between democracy and autocracy.
Ken Roth, Executive Director of Human Rights Watch. Ken, as always, we appreciate your time, especially on a Friday night, and your insights. Thank you.
Thank you.